The definition of genocide by the United Nations in 1948 emphasizes the importance of premeditation or intent. That is defined as genocide. So the element of premeditation or intent is a crucial ingredient in the definition of genocide. What I concluded was that while large numbers of Armenians died in 1915 and in the following war years, this was not part of a premeditated plan on the part of the Ottoman regime to destroy the Armenians. We can later talk about why it did happen and why what was done, but there surely was no intent as the definition of genocide the United Nations requires to destroy the Armenian people, and that's why the issue of intent is so important. This was a very unfortunate affair. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a worthy civil rights organization that generally does not deal with issues like the Armenian massacres. It so happened, however, that an Armenian woman was employed at that time by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and she apparently convinced the editor of one of the magazines published by the Law Center to write an article in which that charge was made. I think the information largely came from her, even though the article was published under the name of somebody else. While I had been called all kinds of names, genocide denier and what have you, to be accused of being in the pay of another government just goes a bit too far. And fortunately, I was able to find legal counsel who represented me. And we prevailed in a suit. That is to say, it never really came to judgment. The Southern Poverty Law Center settled. They retracted their claims and apologized. And there was a small financial settlement as well, and they paid all legal costs. The significance of this is that really almost for the first time, some of the venom and outrageous charges that have been so frequent in this debate were exposed, and people were held accountable for using this kind of vocabulary. It also affirmed that one can disagree with the Armenian position without necessarily being held to be a Turkish partisan. Amazing situation because something that is really established in history doesn't have to be recognized by anyone. I mean, no one, for example, has asked any parliament to recognize the Jewish Holocaust. I mean, historians have established that this happened. There's no need for politicians to become involved. Here, the Armenians thought they could benefit by enlisting the support of politicians, and they have been, as I say, successful. The Turkish side has been inept. The official historiography is making its argument in a very, how shall I put it, inept fashion. They take a position which is really quite indefensible, that A, that the number of victims was small, B, that it was all part of a civil war within a world war, part of an ethnic conflict, and so forth. And unfortunately, therefore, these arguments are just not considered serious by the scholarly community. They're simply written off as partisan argument. There has been some improvement, I think, in the situation. There have been some historians over the last 10, 15 years in Turkey who've taken a somewhat more independent position. There have been several conferences even discussing the issue, which would not have happened earlier. So there's some progress, but still the official and quasi-official Turkish Historical Society, for example, continue to propagate this rather primitive set of arguments. And I think it's a serious problem because in 2015, the Armenians are going to commemorate what they will call the 100th anniversary of their genocide. There's going to be a lot going on. And I'm afraid the Turkish side is going to take a licking. And that is unfortunate because I think they have a case. We don't really have any original records. That is the big problem. We have transcripts by newspapers and so forth, but we don't have any of the documents on which these courts supposedly relied. We have some, as I say, reports on the proceedings, but that surely is not enough to amount to any solid evidence. I mean, compare this to the detailed record of the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which give us an incredibly careful and extensive, detailed picture of the workings of the Nazi regime. These proceedings do nothing of that kind. Well, it is surely significant that my book has received, by and large, favorable reviews by non-Armenian historians of the Middle East and of Turkey. It is my impression that, by and large, historians who are specialists in Turkish history, who are not Armenians, do not accept the Armenian point of view. So what I thought would be useful was to conduct a public survey, a poll of, on one side, Turkish historians who are Armenians and Turkish historians who are not, and compare the findings. And I thought it would clearly show that people who know something about the subject do not swallow the Armenian position blindly and completely. Unfortunately, it turned impossible to raise the necessary funds. Such a survey, we figured, would cost close to $100,000. We had lined up, some friends, colleagues, we had lined up the NORC, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, one of the best and most prestigious survey centers. They were willing to do it, but they wanted quite a bit of money, and such a survey is expensive. We were unable to raise the money, and therefore that poll never took place. I think it's unfortunate because it would greatly help. I think it would indicate to the media and others that the experts, people who have expert knowledge of Turkish history of this period, take a more balanced view and do not endorse the Armenian position. Turks in 1914-15 faced an invasion from Russia over the Caucasus. At the same time, the British were advancing from the Suez Canal and in Iraq, what today is Iraq. The Turkish military situation was difficult. At the same time, the Armenians, who had long armed themselves, started a guerrilla movement in support of the Russian invaders. At that point, the Ottoman government decided that it was essential to remove the Armenian population, who by and large, of course, were supporting the Armenian guerrilla bands. They deported large numbers of Armenians in eastern Anatolia under very trying conditions because the Ottomans were suffering famine at the time. There was a tremendous shortage of food, tremendous amount of corruption. There were not enough guards to protect the convoys against Kurdish bands who were attacking the Armenians, and large numbers of Armenians perished as a result. So I think the deportation took place primarily for political military reasons. as a military necessity, and the unfortunate consequences were not the intent of the deportation. The intent was to safeguard the military situation of the Ottoman army, who were having a hard time. And even though the central government issued rules how the deportations were to proceed, in practice it turned out to be impossible to implement these regulations. So as I said before, there was not enough food, there was not enough protection, and not enough guards. Local officials frequently were involved in robbing, taking over the property of the Armenians, many of whom were quite wealthy. So there was involvement of local officials in some of the most important abuses of the deportation process. The central government was weak and was unable to make its regulations stick. And that was one of the big problems. And Talat Pasha, in fact, in his memoirs concedes as much and has expressed regret over what happened. There have been those who say that the Ottomans could have done somewhat better. I'm not sure. The regime was weak, it was corrupt, it was militarily on the defensive. So what happened really is not surprising. The Armenians argue this was the first genocide of the 20th century. The Turks maintain that this was a part of a civil war, and that the number of Armenians who died is relatively small, and so forth. I questioned the Armenian position primarily because the evidence for what they regard as an instance of genocide simply is not there. For example, the Armenian population of Istanbul and Izmir were for the most part not deported. Their situation during the war was not good, but they were not deported. If indeed the Ottoman regime sought to destroy the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire, why did they leave these populations intact? It's like Hitler exempting the Jews of Berlin and Munich and Cologne from the Holocaust. Armenians who did not belong to the Armenian Church at times were able to achieve exemption. The Armenians who had money were able to buy train tickets and were able therefore to make the deportation far less deadly than it turned out to be for the masses of Armenians from Eastern Anatolia who, because there were no railroads, had to walk on foot for hundreds and thousands of miles. All of that, again, cast doubt on the supposition that the Armenians sought to destroy the Armenian community. If that was their intent, why did they let the Armenians in the west part of the empire buy railroad tickets? And so forth and so on. There are a number of issues that simply, in my view, make the Armenian version unconvincing. We are left with a situation where perhaps something like 40% of the Armenian population at the time perished as a result of famine, as a result of robberies, kidnapping, attacks by Kurdish gangs for the most part, perished later in large numbers in camps where they were concentrated because the Turks proved inadequate in feeding these masses of people. Not surprising, because there was famine in the empire as a whole, and therefore they certainly were not eager to share what little they had with the hated Armenians. So something like 600,000 Armenians died during this time, a horrible tragedy. The Armenian community was displaced. There are relatively few Armenians left in Turkey today. So it was a great tragedy, But it was not, in my view, an instance of genocide, and I think it behooves us in dealing with an episode of this kind to be careful in how we characterize it, how we judge it, how we describe it, and it ought to be treated like any other historical episode. Unfortunately, this has not been the case, that the issue has become highly politicized for the Armenians. This is a kind of a question of identity to affirm the genocide that they allegedly suffered. Yes, large numbers of Turkish soldiers died of famine and disease. We have the detailed report of European missionaries, and I recite these in my book, who describe some of the horrible conditions that were existing in the Turkish army during the war. And some professional students of this affair have concluded that the Turkish army suffered more casualties from disease and famine than from military action, actually. So it was a terrible situation, and therefore it is almost not surprising that the Armenians were treated with less than kid gloves. I think had there been more food available for everyone, perhaps the Armenians would have gotten some food here and there, and there would have been far fewer victims of famine and disease among the deported Armenians. But because the situation was so bad, the results were as disastrous as they were. Yes, there was an attempt to establish a reconciliation commission. Unfortunately, it never got off the ground. One can only hope that in the course of time, both Turks and Armenians will lower the temperature of this debate, and that at some point there will be a willingness to look at it like any other historical controversy and try to resolve it through scholarship rather than through asking politicians to vote whether there was or was not a genocide in 1915. Whether this will happen soon or not is anyone's guess. I'm not terribly optimistic. As I said earlier, there is some change underway in both camps, I think. In Turkey, there are now some historians who have a somewhat more open mind and who are unhappy with the inadequate official version. Among the Armenians, there are some who have initiated dialogues with Turkish historians. They've chosen, for the most part, historians who are more or less in their camp to begin with, but still, there is some willingness to discuss the issue. Much of the time until now, this was simply considered a closed subject for the Armenians, and anyone, like myself, for example, who insisted on reopening it was immediately vilified as a genocide denier. There was nothing to discuss as far as the Armenian position held, and that still is in many ways a widespread attitude. But I think there's some change underway, and as I say, one can only hope that in the course of time this will continue. I think the charge of genocide, the issue of genocide for the Armenians is really kind of an identifying mark. It's a rallying cry that contributes to their existence as an exiled community. For the Armenians, the issue of the genocide is an important psychological element, and they're not, at this point at least, not willing to give it up. I touched on that before, that in the course of time, perhaps, the temperature will be lowered, and at some point it will become possible to approach this subject more soberly. But in the meantime, I think one can only be pessimistic, and with the approach of 2015, when the Armenians will commemorate the 100th anniversary of what happened in 1915, one can expect a good deal of agitation and more heated debate and charges and so forth. So clearly, this will not be a good time to hope for an improvement in relations. In the long run, one can be optimistic, but no one will take out any bets, I'm afraid. I think by and large, the problem is not lack of documentation. I mean, it would be nice to have more, but I found there was enough solid evidence on which to base my conclusion. So I don't think it's a matter of availability of evidence. I think it's a matter of being willing to look at that evidence with unbiased eyes, with an open mind. And that is what has been absent until now. Yes, some of the Armenian archives are still closed. I don't think they will tell us very much that is new, are able quite adequately reconstruct what for the most part happened. And so again, I think it is really not a matter of lack of evidence, it's a matter of using the evidence that we do have.